In today's video, I wanted to talk about why is comic accuracy actually a big deal, mostly when it comes to movies, as we have seen a lot of arguments made against, especially the Zack Snyder verse or the Snyderverse of DC films, that his films are not really comic accurate and they don't represent the comics as much as possible. And this led, of course, to the fact that a lot of people wrongly assume that he doesn't understand the comic parts. And now when comic accuracy comes into my mind, there are two things that we have to get right off the bat. These two things are comic adaptations and comic book movies. Now, comic book adaptations include movies such as, in my mind, 300 and Watchmen, which are of course Zack Snyder films. And there are the comic book movies, which include Man of Steel, Nolan's Dark Knight movies, Batman v Superman, of course, Zack Snyder's Justice League, the Marvel movies as well. And when we are talking about comic accuracy, and especially when we are talking about adaptations, that's the whole point of comic accuracy, right? That the adaptation of a comic to a film should reflect exactly what the comic actually entailed in and of itself. But the thing is, right off the bat, we are talking about two completely different mediums. We are talking about a comic book and we are talking about a 2-hour feature film. Like usually a 4 to 12 issue comic book or graphic novel. They're two completely different mediums. And I feel like that when we're talking about just comic book movies in general, comics should never be a script or the film itself. Comics should be an inspiration or a source of inspiration, because what you see with Zack Snyder's movies is that he picks a lot of inspirations from different comic books and he morphs it into something completely new and original while respecting the comic lore and the comics themselves. And you see with, for example, The Dark Knight, which is like loosely based upon The Long Halloween, but it's a completely different story, but you can get this detective Godfather vibe from it, which in a sense, like these comic books, these source materials should serve as an inspiration, not necessarily a script for the film. Even though in Nolan's case, the movie is largely derivative from the comic book, but he also put his own, like this ultra realistic spin on the story, so it feels like a movie. It feels completely different from the comic itself. And I feel like that translating the exact same storylines from the comics to a completely different medium is not just unoriginal in and of itself, but I feel like this is the epitome of creative bankruptcy, and it just results in an utterly boring story. And this is exactly what Hollywood does and would always do in a sense, because you already have the source material and people like specific source material. So therefore they are incentivized to just copy the whole thing into that, even though it doesn't necessarily work like that. And when it comes to adaptations, I wanted to just add to that, an important case has to be made with Watchmen, that the Watchmen comic is a satire and deconstruction of the comics themselves. And when you make an adaptation about that, you have to take into consideration what Zack Snyder took into consideration, that if you translate a satire of comic books into a film, the audience wouldn't get it because it's a completely different medium. So if you make a movie about the satire of comic books, nobody would see it because it would have to come from a completely different medium. But what the movie actually did is that it was a satire of the superhero movies themselves, and this is why I believe that it works, and this is why it is becoming so much more relevant than when it actually released back in 2009, is that now we see a lot of those tropes exposed basically by the movie. The same goes for the violence in and of itself, that it doesn't want to copy the violence depicted in the comic book, in the Watchmen comic book, but it rather presents to you the violence that is happening in these actual comic book movies and showing you how it would really happen if that violence was actually represented in a way that is true to the violence conducted, basically. And this is why I believe it's one of the most brilliant comic book movies ever made, is because of that. It's an adaptation, but it's a clever way of adapting a story and fitting it to a different medium. And when it comes to movies like Man of Steel, for example, which got heavily criticized for not being comic accurate, even though, as I have previously mentioned before, it pulls a lot of dialogue and lines from like All-Star Superman to Superman's Secret Origins to form this cohesive and, what is especially important, new whole, because Man of Steel was a Superman story that I was not expecting that I needed, but I embraced it for what it was, because it actually presented me with a side of the character that I have not seen before. And with Man of Steel, I got that vibe from Superman, that Superman is actually a human being. This is why I connected, and audiences could connect with the character more. And when it comes to like movies like Batman v Superman, Zack Snyder has always referenced that The Dark Knight Returns Batman, Frank Miller's comic book or graphic novel, was a big inspiration for him when just developing not necessarily the story but the Batman of that universe. And even he got a lot of flack for that, and also for Lex Luthor, because Lex Luthor was a completely different character. Alexander Luthor Jr. was a completely different character than what the audiences have seen before and what you would expect from a character like that. But the truth is, this is a different version of Lex Luthor, because Zack knew that in order for this story to work, he would want to have a younger version of Lex Luthor. This is why he went with Lex Luthor Jr. And if you actually check the comics, I believe around the Death of Superman issues, there was this Lex Luthor who had long ginger hair, and I believe he was even Lex Luthor Jr. at that part. But then again, this thing that people at the time rejected these new things, even though they were derivative of the comic books, that they were new in a sense that these things were never translated before into the medium of live action movie. But on the other side of the coin, when it comes to The Dark Knight, there was a character named Rachel Dawes, who I'm sure you guys are familiar with, who was completely made up for this trilogy of movies. But of course, people didn't really have a negative reaction to that, because why would they have a negative reaction to that? Because people don't read comic books in general. And maybe the most important part was that I mentioned before that The Dark Knight is a derivative of the Long Halloween story, but what The Dark Knight does differently is that it takes away that mystical element of the Batman character. The movie grounds the character in reality, that the character is no longer this mystical beast that he appears in the comic books and especially in the Long Halloween. But although this interpretation of the character is widely accepted as the best interpretation, even though it is nowhere near as true to that as previous interpretations we have seen in the movies. And one of the biggest questions that I would like to ask everybody, why is something original scoffed at or not accepted nowadays? Because as I've mentioned in The Dark Knight back in 2008, there were a lot of things accepted because the movie was so well written, even though you could actually take out Batman and put a detective character instead of him, and the story would have played out the same way. Therefore, if you take out like the whole crux of the story, Batman, the story just works without him. But people didn't really catch on to that. But when it comes to Zack Snyder's movies especially, and the originality that he brings to the table with creating new stories and new characters or interpretations of those very characters, those interpretations are being scoffed at and not accepted, and I don't really understand why, because if we don't accept these changes, it is going to lead to the death of creativity, as I have previously alluded to when it comes to Hollywood especially. As if we don't allow creators to interpret characters in different ways, it is going to result in studios banking for the same stories over and over again, which we have read in the comic books, because those stories are already well established and accepted by the fan base. And that's going to result in no new stories or characters create their interpretations. And that's one of the biggest reasons why comics are present today, is because they evolved. There was a realization that change was needed in order for comics to be in business, and that these characters and stories needed to be modernized. And I feel like that this is what we have to work towards as a society to rather not try to compare interpretations, because The Dark Knight worked well in 2008, but now it doesn't work as well, and nowhere near doesn't work as well as it did 12 or 13 years ago, because we have had so many different, not just interpretations of Batman, as we're gonna have the Robert Pattinson interpretation as well, but we have had so much more high production value superhero movies in general that movie just feels like child's play compared to that. But anyway, that's all I wanted to say for today. I would also love to know your opinion about the whole topic. What do you think about comic accuracy, and do you consider it a big deal, or are you rather inclined that we should treat comics as this inspiration point? I would love to hear all of your thoughts in the comments down below. I hope you have enjoyed the video. Please leave a like, subscribe, and I will see you in the next one. And until then, remember to keep it insightful.